by trying to enlist your support by quoting the greatest French statesman of the post-war period, Charles de Gaulle. He said in 1942, democracy coincides exactly, for me, with national sovereignty. The two are indivisible. And in this, he was channeling Article 3 of that great statement of Enlightenment values, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Quote, the principle of sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body, no individual can exert authority which does not emanate expressly from it. And this principle, the principle of democracy and national self-determination being indivisible, is violated in many, many, many ways by the EU. Pooling sovereignty means diluting democracy. Break the umbilical cord between the government and the governed, between the political leaders and the people they owe their authority to, and you destroy democratic accountability. Democracy and national self-determination go hand in hand, and if the people cannot determine their national destiny, they've effectively been disenfranchised. How is the EU an affront to democracy? Let me count the ways. Its institutions and workings are more or less completely incomprehensible, and deliberately so. How many presidents are there of the EU? Does anyone know how many presidents there are in the EU? I suspect even Hugo would have difficulty naming all of the EU presidents. You might think there are 5, after the famous 5 presidents report, which claims that Europe can politically, economically, fiscally unify itself by 2025. But in fact, there are 7. There's the President of the European Commission, the President of the European Council, the President of the Council of the European Union, and don't ask me what the difference is between the President of the European Council and the President of the Council of the European Union. Then there's the President of the European Central Bank, the President of the European Parliament, the President of the European Court of Justice, and the President of the European Court of Auditors. Who can name all 7 of these presidents? Who can even name 5 or even 3? I bet you can't. And if you don't know who the most powerful office holders are in the EU, how can we possibly hope to hold them to account? What about the European Parliament, I hear you say? Is that not the instrument of democratic accountability within the EU? Well, the European Parliament is the only parliament in the world in which the members cannot propose or repeal legislation. It has less power than the House of Lords. The only people who can propose laws in the European Parliament are the unelected European Commissioners. And bear in mind that even Nick Clegg, one of the leaders of the Remain campaign, acknowledges that in the last 2 decades, at least 50% of the United Kingdom's laws have originated in the European Union. That is to say, they've originated with unelected European commissioners. And this arrangement isn't simply undemocratic, it's anti-democratic. Because quite often the people appointed European commissioners are people who've just lost elections, people who've just been explicitly rejected by their electorates. In our country, Neil Kinnock, leader of the Labour Party, lost a general election, was made a European Commissioner. Peter Mandelson, another prominent Labour Party politician, lost a national general election, was instantly made a European Commissioner. There's another example in France. Edith Cresson, France's first female Prime Minister, the shortest serving French Prime Minister, I believe, served for less than 1 year under François Mitterrand between 91 and 92. It was such a colossal failure that the socialists did disastrously in the 1992 French regional elections. What was her reward? She had to stand down as Prime Minister and was almost instantly promoted to becoming a European Commissioner. And then 5 years later was removed in a corruption scandal in which it emerged that, amongst other things, she'd given a job to her dentist. So the absence of democratic accountability means the EU can shower riches and perks on its employees with absolute abandon. No one notices, no one can hold these people to account. So how many of the EU's 50,000 employees do you think are paid more than the British Prime Minister? And bear in mind that the British PM is paid €183,375 every year. What percentage of the 50,000 EU employees do you think get more than that? 1%? 2%? It's 20%. 1 in 5 of these Eurocrats gets paid more than the British Prime Minister. And that's not all. They get showered with perks. The relocation allowance, the household allowance, the family allowance, the entertainment allowance, the private education allowance, so they don't have to send their children to the schools they're notionally responsible for. And of course, the private healthcare allowance, which includes free Viagra. MEPs get paid €320 a day just for turning up. They get €52,000 just to cover phone bills and computers, $287,000 to cover staffing costs, so of course they can employ their wives and children. They've granted themselves, this is probably the most shocking thing of all. Employees of the European Union, MEPs, our supposed elected representatives, our tribunes, have exempted themselves from having to pay normal rates of taxation, just like the aristocracy in pre-revolutionary France. And actually a direct contravention of Article 13 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, for the maintenance of a public force and for the expenditures of administration, and a common contribution is indispensable. It must be equally distributed among the citizens. Well, it isn't equally distributed amongst those who work for the EU and the citizens, because they pay a different rate of tax, like the detested French aristocracy. To those not on this gravy train, the EU seems increasingly like a racket. And it's worth remembering that the European Court of Auditors has failed to give the EU's annual budget a clean bill of health in 21 years. How else does the EU express its contempt for democracy? Denmark voted against the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, Ireland against the Nice Treaty in 2001, and the Treaty of Lisbon in 2008. And they were asked by the European Union to simply hold further referendums and go on holding referendums until they produced the result that the EU wanted. In 2005, when France and the Netherlands voted against the European Constitution, their verdict was just ignored by the European Union. In 2011, Silvio Berlusconi resigned and was replaced by a new government led by the unelected Mario Monti, a former European Commissioner. And the government that he led contained not a single party representative or a single elected parliamentarian. In 2011, George Papandreou, the PM of Greece, was replaced by the unelected former ECB member Lucas Papademos. In 2015, when the Greek people rejected the terms of the Greek bailout, their verdict was ignored, and even harsher terms than the terms they rejected were then imposed on the Greek people. There's an old joke in Brussels that if the EU was applying to become a member of the European Union, it would be rejected for being insufficiently democratic. So how does this political alienation manifest itself? What has been the response to this contempt for democracy, this lack of democratic accountability within the EU? We've seen the growth of anti-EU movements across the continent, objecting to principles which, whether they consented to them or not in the first place, have now become irreversible. Freedom of movement, freedom of labour became freedom of movement. That creates downward pressure on low-paid jobs, is very unpopular amongst working-class workers. Immigration, there's not much we can do about immigration. If one country in the EU, like Germany, decides that it wants to admit 1 million Syrian refugees, that becomes a problem for the remainder of the countries within the Schengen area, but there's nothing they can do about it. Being a member of the Eurozone has led to incredibly high levels of unemployment. Youth unemployment in Greece is almost 50%. Even in France, it's practically 25%. They object to free trade deals, such as TTIP, the one about to be done between the EU and America, which brought 150,000 demonstrators out onto the streets in Berlin last year. And we can see manifestations of this dissatisfaction everywhere we look. Beppe Grillo's 5-star movement polled almost a quarter of the vote for the Chamber of Deputies at the 2013 Italian general election. The Sweden Democrats won almost 13% of the popular vote at the 2014 Swedish general election. The PVV, 13.5% of the vote at the 2014 European election in Holland. UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, won 27.4% of the popular vote in the British 2014 European election, putting them in first place. The True Finns, 17.5% of the vote at 38 seats in the Finnish parliamentary elections of 2015. Golden Dawn, 7% in the general election in Greece last year. The AfD in Germany earlier this year, almost a quarter of the popular vote in Saxony. And the National Front in France, of course, won 12 mayoralties in 2014 and came first in the 2014 European elections in France. The people of Europe are in open revolt against the EU, and it's only likely to get worse as the Eurozone crisis resurfaces and the migration crisis continues. I'll just give 2 more minutes.
One, please.
Okay. Well, you might say, can't we make the institutions of the European Union more democratic? Well, we saw from David Cameron's pitiful attempt to renegotiate Britain's relationship with the European Union earlier this year that the European Union is allergic to reform. Reform is a slow, arduous, downright impossible process, so the chances of reform happening anytime soon are incredibly remote. But even if you could initiate a reform process, you cannot make the European Union more democratic because you can't have a democracy without a demos. There is no commonality between the different peoples of Europe as they exist within the European Union. Maybe in '57, when the Treaty of Rome was signed, and there were just 6 members, there might have been enough in common, common institutions, customs, traditions, to create a sense of demos which could have informed a united political bloc. But when it was enlarged to 9 in '73 and now 28, the chances of there being enough in common between all the different people, for heaven's sake, we speak 23 different languages in Europe, and that's just the official languages, 60 if you don't count the official just the official languages. I'll end with Boris Johnson, one of the leaders of the Remain campaign. He controversially said last week that numerous European leaders had fallen afoul of trying to recreate the dream of creating the glory of the Roman Empire once again in Europe, and cited a number of European leaders that had failed in this grand folly. Philip II of Spain, Napoleon. Every time it's been tried, it's been unsuccessful because the people of Europe are too different, too disparate, they don't have enough in common to become part of a single political union. It's folly, and we should abandon that plan as soon as we can. I'll just end on a quote by William Pitt, a former British Prime Minister, who said, "England will save herself by her exertions, and will, I trust, save Europe by her example." And I think that if we do vote leave and negotiate an orderly exit from the European Union, we can create a model of associate membership, special status that could then become the model for the rest of the disparate European nations, which will be a much more successful, much longer lasting union than the ever closer union that is doomed to failure. Thank you.
So one question, as you mentioned, Boris. Do you agree with him when he says that the EU is Hitler?
Well, to be fair to Boris, he did not say, he did not compare the European Union
true politician
to the Third Reich. He was simply making the point that numerous tyrants that tried to unify
He did
Europe.
not mention Hitler,
No,
that the EU is like Hitler.
Well, he did mention Hitler. It was a throwaway remark rather than the centerpiece of his argument, which was that all attempts to create a unified Europe since the fall of Rome.
No, I got your Gibbons point. That being said, how come you're not a member of UKIP rather than a member of the Conservative Party? Seriously.
I describe myself as a classical liberal. And
What does that mean?
a classical liberal is someone who believes in a liberal economic policy, in free trade, but is also socially liberal. And UKIP are quite economically liberal, but socially they're not that liberal. So for instance, they oppose gay marriage, which is something I'm very much in support of. So I wouldn't feel comfortable in UKIP, but I do feel comfortable in the modern Conservative Party.
A question to you, Hugo.